Yo, 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 and welcome to part number 3 already, and the final part of this remake of Selecta. Today's video, we're gonna dive into the build-up and the drop, and we're gonna see the final elements that make up this epic song. If you haven't watched part 1 or part 2 yet, they go over the intro and the guitar riff that are before the build-up, essentially. You can watch them here, but if you have, then all I gotta say is let's dive in to see how the rest went. Alright, so we are in Ableton again, and we left off having done this little intro section here, this guitar bridge, and now we're gonna go to the build-up and the drop, introducing some new elements, getting the drums right, just in general, introducing a nice dynamic that leads from the build-up to the drop. So this is what we're making, starting from the end of the guitar section.
That's them of all time. If you know that, if you this way, you must get slapped.
Selecta.
All the selecta for play a duff cut. Cause a boy body drop, we full of tough cut up. Then the selecta become a duff cut up. Then the selecta boy just drop. All the selecta for play a duff cut. Cause a boy body drop, we full of tough cut up. Then the selecta become a duff cut up. Then the selecta boy just drop.
All right. So let's see what we've got. We left off at this guitar bridge, even though that was pretty simple. What it does is it sets the tone for the horn and the brass and the main lead synth or brassy synth to come in. And just like before, every transition is prefaced by one of these bass reverbs. And again, we've got this bass reverb here, which sounds like this reverse reverb. Which nicely leads the guitar into the horn sound. And it is once again simply just a reverse reverb from the first hit of the brass section, which we've got right here. Just the recorded reverse reverb of the first note of this brass. And let's first take a look at what happens to the drums, because the drums come in. We had some of those distorted hi-hats and whatever before, but now we actually have some drums come in. And the difference between the build-up and the drop is that first it's sort of more like a broken little beat, not yet a drum and bass rhythm to sort of go with that more, maybe let's call it Jamaican vibe of the start of the track. And the drums sound like this. That's almost Teach Me How to Dougie once again. If you know, you know. So what have we got here? Well, we've got a kick that is hitting slightly differently than a normal drum bass pattern, right? We've got it hitting on the first beat, and then on the 2.2 here, then on the first beat again, and then on the 0.2 again, but also on the first beat. So it's dum, di, di, do, di. Right, so we got that for the kick, which, by the way, the kick is essentially just a kick sample that is pitched to about 100 hertz with just the frequencies taken out below 30 hertz like you should. And then for the snare, it's not really a snare. It's more like a very aggressive finger snapping, right? Which is another really cool and interesting choice from Chase and Status, which you tend to see a lot more happening now, that the snare samples, especially in some more jump-uppy songs, but also kind of maybe going into jungle, are sometimes just sort of clap-snap combinations. So that's what we went for here. And as you can see, we've got a snap, which is literally this sound, a clap, and a little bit of a snare for the body, and we're going to combine that. So we've got all these sounds together that make the snare sound, which is very, very solid, despite not really having as much body as the snare. Does do a really nice job of adding a really nice embodied rhythm to the build-up and the drop. So let's have a look at this snare group then. You'll see that there's some group processing. We'll get to that in just a second. But basically we have a snap sample, so just all taken from Splice. This, basically a finger snap. We have a clap sample, and we have a actual snare sample. And there's a little bit of processing. So the snap, I really only want the higher frequencies, somewhere above like 500 hertz. That's all I want. And I applied a little bit of saturation and some convolution reverb. Everything here has convolution reverb, which is what I really would recommend to put on your drums rather than normal reverb, because it gives more of an organic, roomy sort of drum room kind of feel to it, especially everything in this made for drums category. Super cool. Check that out. So basically, this is just a snap sample with some overdrive to sort of change the timbre a little bit for it, make it a little bit more aggressive, some frequencies cut out, and a little bit of saturation going on the analog clip. Then we've got a clap sample, which has about the same processing, but has just a little bit of EQing here, just to get more sort of, you know, higher, mid-higher tonalities out of the clap. And this was just a choice because I wanted to sound more like whatever the original sample was that Chase and Status used here. And the same for the shifter. The shifter, once again, was a way to get the timbre that I wanted. And this fine knob is really nice for that, because claps and snaps and all those sort of more noisy sounds are actually they're just noise. Changing the fine around doesn't do much to the note that it's played at, because it doesn't really have a note, but it will change the character of the sound. So a nice tool to play around with if you feel like you've got a sample that doesn't quite hit it just yet. You can see if you can change the pitch a little bit or accentuate some frequencies to make it sound more like what you want. And then of course we have this snare sample. So the snap and the clap together sound like this. So that's quite noisy. And then I really wanted to just give that some more body. So I got a snare sample, sort of lighter snare sample from Slice. And I pitched it in a way that it wasn't too low pitched. And then I also cut out a bunch of these frequencies here, accentuated pretty much the same convolution reverb on it, same saturation. And really just we're combining these things together. And then we have a sound that sounds roughly like what I want. But I did find I wanted to sort of make that a little bit fuller. So that's how I came to add some frequencies here. 2 big camel bumps around 3 and 2. So that sounds good. So this versus gives it a little bit more presence. And what we can see throughout this build up here is that we've got this sort of breakbeatish thing going on. So this one. And those drums kind of drop out in the part leading up to the drop, except for the one little part before the drop, just as actually everything else cuts out. So the riser cuts out and the bass sound cuts out and etc. You know, normally you have a vocal just before the drop, and this vocal is accompanied by just one snap as if to announce the drop, which you can hear like this. Which kind of echoes into the beginning of the drop, which is a nice little touch here. And what we see then, so there's no snares in that second part of the build-up, but there is just a kick drum, and this is just a very simple kick roll. It's just increasing in speed. And then what's done is, what happens in a lot of going towards the drop is some of the lows are taken out so that it becomes more thin, so that when the drums hit back at the start of the drop, they come back as feeling more powerful. So that's what we got going on over here as well. On the drums group here, we had this intro effects, which is of course now turned off. And then we have this auto filter, which moves over time to sort of like wash over all the drums. You can see it moving here. And you can see that the automation here allows for this little sweep here to happen, but then for that big snap just before the drop, it crushes back to just normal, so that hits at full intensity, and then the rest of the drums after that as well. And then the last thing is that in the second part of this build-up, we also get the hi-hat here that is just hitting now like this. In a very similar fashion to the kick. And then last but not least, on the drum section, we actually have another snare roll. It's really quite simple. We already made that in the intro. We have this little snare roll with the delay on there, and we can just copy that. That's what you see a lot, that elements from the intro are being reused in the drop or the other way around. So we just had the exact same snare roll, except it's a little bit longer, and we have some filter movement going on over here, which just make it a little bit thinner. And it doesn't have to be a very present element, but it does add a little bit of extra anticipation into the drop. See if you can hear it. So it's quiet on the background, but it does fill up that space really nicely. And so let's get to the brass, the heavy sound that is sort of the real meat of the song. And it sounds like this. It's almost like the Imperial March from Star Wars. I have a whole separate video on how these brass patches work. Actually, this entire sound, how it works, there's a whole nother video about it, which you can watch over here on this link. But let's go over it really quickly. So what have we got here? We've got this brass group, which has a top brass, a mid brass, and a bass brass. Just like what we did with the guitars, the notes are separated in exactly the same manner to give those top notes more of their own tonality and to give them some additional processing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the patches because actually creating a brass patch is really difficult, and you can do it, but you might not want to. The good thing is that you can just buy really good brass presets. I can tell you from experience, I'm a relatively decent sound designer. I made a whole bunch of brasses myself for this. They just didn't add up to what I got from the preset pack from Mono Sounds, which I will link in the description. And just right out of the box, these brass sounds are amazing. And all you had to do was just a little bit of extra processing to make it sound exactly like Chase and Status. So there's two patches that we're using here. We got this brass hexagon, which is from the Mono Sounds brass pack. And then on the mid brass, we've got this brass EDM stack, and both of them are essentially, they're just very distorted sine waves that have a lot of movement and distortion on them. Essentially, the idea of a brass is that it is a very distorted signal that has a sort of a time stretching on it, that has distortion that moves over time, so not the same distortion throughout the whole sound, that has a lot of sort of extra voices added to it, so hyper and dimension are always big parts of it, and unison on the oscillators is a very big part of it, and some FM from B you'll always see in these patches because just adding that extra distortion. And what you'll see is if you look at all these LFOs, they modulate various parameters, and that's why making a brass is so hard, and why I would honestly just recommend that you go and find a really cool preset for it. If you want to know more about how these patches actually work, go and watch that video, which is titled Heavy Brass Leads Like Chase and Status Selecta. For now, let's just dive into what else we did with these patches. So we have a sort of darker preset from that Mono Sounds patch here, playing the lower notes, which sound like this by itself. And there's actually not that much extra processing needed. I did, however, see that on the original patch, you can determine the length of a brass note whenever you're making something, and you want it to be quite long. So this little LFO here that determines the filter movement and some of the levels, we want this to be long, so we put it at a bar. And then all we really had to do, to be honest, to this is just add a bunch of lows to give it that extra sort of rumblingness on the bottom, right? So without it sounds like, but with it sounds like. So that really gives it more of that sort of tuba, Star Wars-y kind of extra character. And then we have this mid brass here, which is just another patch. And the reason it's another patch is because this one was very dark and heavy and did not have much tops. But we wanted to separate the notes because the top notes need a lot more top character. And the bottom notes from the hexagon patch simply didn't cut it. So I got another patch here, which is called the brass EDM stack. And this one is a lot more high-end energy. You'll notice that. So you can hear that the top notes there have a lot more character than, for example, here. Those just sound kind of shelly and weird. So that's why we had to choose two different patches. And we just got these top notes playing here. And there is a little bit of additional processing, right? But because we only want the top stuff of this, we filter out some of those lows. We obviously pitch these notes higher, and we accentuated some frequencies in that upper middle range at like 2-3K, just so that we got a little bit more extra body to those top notes. And you can see at the top brass part here, essentially it's the same patch, but then playing an octave higher with more of the lows cut out, that same frequency accentuated, but also I put a glue compressor on it because I wanted to take up everything that was sort of around what we just had, so those extra high frequencies and those slightly below 2K frequencies, and sort of equalize them, bring them up a little bit more. The resulting sounds are, for the mid brass, it sounds like this. And then we add some extra crunch with this top brass. And together it would sound like this. Nice. And then of course there's some group processing here. You can choose to saturate it a bit more if you want. I always like adding an overdrive on everything just because it just kind of makes everything a little bit more focused, saturated on a particular frequency. And I found that because we were looking for that low end crunch, saturating it around sort of that 300 hertz area really gave it that sort of sound that you wanted. And then to further accentuate some of this crunchiness on the top, I did a high shelf, which, 9 out of 10 times, if you don't want something to sound flat, you can just go into your equalizer and see what a shelf does, because it really can work magic. It doesn't have to be that difficult. It can actually be easy sometimes. And then the only other thing that's really on here is some sidechaining with Duck Buddy, a reverb at just very normal levels, a 20% mix and a normal decay. And then there is some filter movement going on, which we will use to get this out of the way for the drop. So what you can see is that the mix of this reverb is automated. So if we go to this brass group, we go to the mix here, you see that in the second part of this buildup, the mix actually goes up. And what that does is it's a technique to wash away the main synth sound before you reintroduce it in the drop. And I'll show you what it sounds like playing with normal mix. So this is a lower mix of like 20%, and it just makes the sound the way that you want the sound actually to sound. So roomy, but not too much. But as we increase that mix, it's going to make the patch sound more washed away. So that does a lot to take away from the sound before reintroducing it and really add to that tension that you want to create before the drop. And then so another cool trick is you might have seen that there's a utility on here as well that also has the gain automated. And the reason that you want to do this is because just before the drop, you want to usually have a vocal or you have some other maybe percussive element or something else. You want pretty much the rest of everything to be quiet. And even when you end the notes before that section, the reverb might have a long enough tail to sort of not end before that part of the drop. And that's just going to make it messy because just a bit of silence before the drop is going to make that drop hit extra hard. So you can just grab a utility and actually just make it go to minus infinity just before the drop to create some extra impact. And then of course, leading into the drop, again, to create that impact is also some risers, some of the stuff that we've used before, a riser, a tonal riser, which goes something like this, and a white noise, which goes something like this. These are all just samples from Splice that you can do as much processing with as you want. I usually quite like to put an extra reverb on them, wash them out a little bit more. You definitely want to cut out the lows here because we don't need that to clash with the rest. And what's also interesting is when you're looking at a buildup, for example, in the transitions here, you'll see that right on the line is when this riser stops or goes into its own reverse, right? But when you have the drop, it doesn't. And it's for the same reason that we applied this utility here, this utility automation, is because we want things to be quiet. We want everything not to lead up to the drop, but to slightly before the drop, and then we want it to be quiet. So that's actually why you take these risers and you end them slightly before the drop, just to create a little sort of moment of silence that creates extra impact for when that drop hits. And then so what have we got here? Well, we've got basically everything that we need for the drop is already here. It just needs to be rearranged slightly differently. We've got all of these effects that are doing their little thing here that we're just gonna reintroduce into the drop. We'll talk about that in a minute. We've already got the whole brass group here at actually exactly the notes that they're going to be playing in the drop. We've got the drums already sorted, but we just need to put them in a different rhythm. And of course, well, we've got the vocal here that we need to play with a little bit. So let's have a look at that then. Let's say, well, what are we gonna do to the drums? Well, the drums were like this, right? But into the drop, they're going to turn into just a normal drum bass rhythm. So they're going to go from this build up to with just a normal drum and bass rhythm where this entire snare group hits whenever the snare would hit. And we've got this little hi-hat sort of filling up the space. So it's bum. So we already have all those elements, we just need to rearrange them. And what you'll find a lot is that before the drop, almost all the elements are already there in some capacity. It's just that they might be filtered out or they might be in a different, rhythm, like the drums, etc., etc. So actually, if you make the drop first, is very easy to sort of extend it back into what the buildup would be, or the breakdown would be, or even the intro would be. So we've got this very simple kick and snare pattern here. We've got this hi-hat filling up that space, hitting every time on the 0.3. And then we've got actually this brass group playing just exactly the same notes, but the difference is that here it got all washed out, so it didn't feel, you know, like we had too much of that going on in the end of the buildup, and then it just comes back full swing here. And then of course we want that impact to be extra big when that big brass hits once again for the drop. So we've got this explosion sample here, sounds like this. And we've got a big white noise riser. One thing to note is when the drop hits, you want to keep having the tension increase and decrease over time. And one really good way to do that is just by messing around with some of these white noise sweeps, and maybe also the tonal riser again, maybe some of these explosions, maybe some of these cymbal crashes that we had here. You can really mix and match to sort of see what gives your desired end result. So for example, this sweep is leading from the down sweep, which gives impact on the drop, back into introducing the next section, right? It goes all the way to going back in there. And then another nice thing that you can do is here, maybe this white noise should sort of be on the background because the main element is the brass that comes in, and it's just here to give it some extra power. But what, for example, happens a lot in the second part of the drop is you want to switch things up, right? So actually what happens quite a bit is that a louder white noise is introduced so that it feels like that section is a little bit more new. And then along with that, what I noticed in here is that that's also when some shakers get introduced. So another percussive element. So you can hear it. We can go from something without the shakers and without this extra really present white noise to with just those two elements. And it does make it sound almost a little bit new. So that's just another cool way to sort of make things develop over time and tell a bit more of a story. One other thing worth noticing is that, again, we have one of these bass reverbs here, which is essentially just, again, that first note of the brass section recorded as a reverb, the initial taken out, and the reverse sample just included here in the same way as these risers here, right? So they're just all leading up to this little bit of silence before the drop. And then, of course, we have the vocals. So that little bit of silence, it's filled up by the main vocal, which I've separated into a few channels here, but essentially it's just this part, right? It's like this. So normally this would be a cut from your main sample. You would have your main sample playing, and the most powerful part, you cut it out and you put it before the drop. That's what they did here as well. And then what we see is the vocals are used to create a layer under the drop that makes it sound less empty. We don't have that many elements. As a matter of fact, we really only have sort of those white noise risers and sweeps and that really heavy brass element. And so we're missing a bit of character. And one thing that happens a lot, and especially in dance floorish music, but now you see it appear a lot more in all kinds of drum and bass, is that there will be a repeat of, for example, either the part before the drop or some other part of the vocal that sounds good when it's on repeat. So for example, here we have just this little chop of the sample, which is this. And it just repeats over and over and over again throughout the drop, but it's band passed, so it has a lot less strength. It just has, you know, a little bit of these middle frequencies here, mid to high maybe, and it's auto panned a little bit as well. So that means that it's kind of on a ping pong delay almost. It goes from the right ear to the left ear to the right, but not completely, just slightly changes how loud it plays in each ear with every hit, which gives the perception of roominess, which gives the perception of this actually being from maybe like a live concert where the sound waves bounce off the walls in a more analog manner than just, you know, hearing everything from your headphones. Now it might sound stupid just like that, but it actually really ducks very nicely under the main sound. And the trick to make it sound professional is to not just make it be one overly repeated sound, but to pick a bed of sounds that repeat and to actually create some syncopation with that, create a rhythm. We've done that here with two elements, but I'm 100% sure that in the original song there's more stuff going on that I can't quite hear. But instead of just having this, we have another element that introduces itself as well. That just makes it a little bit more exciting and makes it slightly more of a sound bed. And both of these are band passed. They have some delay and some auto panning, but that's just about it. And then, you know, you might choose to put some extra reverb on it to wash it out a little bit more. Now you can hear, I'll play the full drop, and you can hear that it sort of really nicely fills up whatever space was left. That riser. So yeah, that concludes it. That is just about everything. I'm pretty sure I might have missed one or two things because this is a long video to record. But if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to answer anything that you got. I hope that you learned a little bit from this reproduction. It was certainly super fun for me. I came across a whole bunch of cool things, especially just the creative use of layering and little delay things and ways to transition, like this reverse reverb. There's just so much golden nuggets into listening to what your favorite artists are doing and sort of trying to emulate that. So I do recommend you to go and try and create this stuff yourself and listen to the song and see, you know, what you can learn just by hearing what other people are doing. All right, that was the video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't. Tell all your friends, and I hope you have a really great day.